Hi, this is part three of the talk on diabetes to Ayurveda to Ozampic, talk that we were doing at OSHA USF. Now, earlier we talked about the history of diabetes as to how it's not a new disease and varieties of treatment, starting starvation diet, were tried before the groundbreaking discovery of insulin. And some of the experimental work that was done in Europe, which showed that an animal can survive without pancreas. And with the advent of biochemistry, insulin was extracted from animal pancreas tissues and was injected first in animal experiments with good results, later with somewhat more purified into human subjects with dramatic improvement. And that changed the whole spectrum of diabetes from dying in insulin coma to uh, experiencing hypoglycemia, that is low blood sugar. Now, even in the early days, the founders of diabetologists or clinicians on both sides of the Atlantic were aware of the complications and were rightly fearful of it, that diabetic patients were getting eyesight problems and were dying of heart disease. So we were trading survival for early death with other complications. And perhaps we had a very simplistic approach. We thought that sugar, insulin, and diabetes, they were all one-line equation, but insulin had a very exquisite role in what we reviewed as food partitioning, in providing very tiny amounts of uh, insulin inside each and every cell for glucose control. And all the three food groups were intricately related. And now, in the early days of depression, people did not live long enough to survive and have heart disease. But with the rise of affluence and with soldiers returning from Europe, where and obviously with the rise of industrial revolution, smoking had become a lot more prevalent, and there was an explosion of heart disease, and a national task force were formed. And we talked about Ansel Adams. No, I'm sorry. That's Ansel Keys, not Ansel Adams. Sorry, he was a photographer. So he was a physiologist, was involved in many long-term population-based research in varieties of European countries, and observed that fat and cholesterol had a lot to do with it. Now, obviously, so that was a conclusion based on observation studies, but the study had some faults in data collection. But he was a big authority, and his word carried the day. And with the money pouring into American Heart Association and the funds that were being poured into research, at the same time, the Framingham study was started, and the observations became apparent that cholesterol was related. Now, this is the quite fault that occurs in medicine, that correlation is not causation. So maybe we walked into that fundamental trap of not understanding the molecular pathology of the disease and the role of other factors such as immunity, uh, varieties of small fat molecules, stress, and obviously the toxic effects of industrialization and inflammation that we didn't take into account. Now, we were all aware of the major complications of diabetes that we talked about. Okay, so the impetus from allowing patients to have high fat diet changed to restricting fat in the diet based on this. And obviously the various commissions were appointed, and the United USDA started issuing guidelines from a really early recommendations exploded to dramatic guidelines with verifying excruciating details about various food groups and the food pyramid and all that took place in the 70s and 80s. And in fact, in spite of that, the obesity epidemic continued, as we'll talk about today at great length. Okay, and since we already talked that since the days of Galton, basic metabolic body mass index was the way to find what is called as a normal man. But normal male is a very hard definition to define, because what is normal is difficult depending upon what ethnicity, what age group we're dealing with. And but it was a crude criteria that had withstood the test of time. It's being questioned as to maybe that was not quite as sensitive as we thought out to be, but it's still that millions of physicians swear by it, and criteria have been defined as underweight, normal, overweight, and obese. And based on this, we can say that as many as 35 to 40% of American population is classified as obese. And the same thing is true in various Western countries. And we talked about the various types of fat, the so-called good fat and bad fat. Okay, and the fat that is surrounding the organs versus subcutaneous fat. I give the example of Japanese sumo wrestlers. Okay, and how body scan, which is a special type of X-ray, dual energy X-ray, but that's a very expensive and complicated way to decide fat is. But that's a research tool, and it shows as to how different compositions as to where the fat is stored. For example, whether it's in your bottom or whether they're around your belly. That's why the waist-hip ratio is being promoted. And then the diet wars were fought vigorously from Dr. Atkins, who was a cardiologist, and so was Dr. Ornish that we talked about. And Dr. Atkins' diet was undoubtedly more popular because people initially lost weight based on the metabolism, because if you eat high-fat diet, you get full and you take less total calories. And obviously, when it did not promote vegetarian diet. But I mean, he may have had some truth, but he never carried out any long-term studies, double-blind studies, which is the gold standard by which any hypothesis is checked. On the other hand, Dean Ornish went exactly in the opposite direction, recommended strict vegetarian diet, restricting dramatically carbohydrates, and just giving the essential nutrients and reducing calories. And his diet was hard to follow for people who are used to standard American industrialized fare. But he took patients who are at the end of their line, that have had a couple of bypasses or surgeries, several angioplasties, and put them on this strict diet, and then transported this patient to do from California, where his base was, to Texas, and did a positron emission tomography and showed that yes, atherosclerosis could be reversed. Okay, the same way, that so that was and his so it was a difficult diet, but it did work. And again, diet has always been a big concern from the times immemorial as to what should we eat, because that's essential for survival. And this trend continues. This is just the picture that I had taken at Barnes and Noble about, and this is the pyramid of Atkins' diet was popular. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Atkins did die of heart disease, while the Ornish diet, was much more reasonable, with vegetables, whole grains, unrefined, and along with that, fruits, lentils, and nuts, avocados, and some egg whites. So you can just see it was a more sensible diet, but undoubtedly it was hard to practice. Then we talked briefly about the sugar substitute, that they have some role, and saccharin was maligned due to bladder cancer. But the other words, have, now whether how safe they will be in long term, that remains to be seen, type of thing. Okay, but they're a good substitute, at least for the time being. Okay, then we talked about that obesity has been a concern for scientists for a long time, and English physician named William Bentinck, was an undertaker. I'm sorry, and he wrote about letters on corpulence. So, and he recommended the so-called avoiding sugars and bread type of diet, and wrote letters on corpulence. And he was on the right track at that time. You can just see how obese he was. And similarly, on the other side also, various French people who put the finger on the right culprit, that is the large amount of carbohydrates and sugar that were becoming popular in Europe at that time. Okay, so and so all this was related to okay, the prosperity that was associated. Now we already talked about the sugar substitute. That's been around for a long time, since the late 19th century. I'm sorry, 19th century, correct? Yeah. And again, and now as we learned more and more science, it became apparent that that all fats were not same, basically. So there were different types of fat, which were polyunsaturated, saturated, the so-called trans fats, and the fats that are solid at room temperature were the more culprit for raising your LDL cholesterol. Now, again, this knowledge was not apparent earlier, and we just relied on things that we could measure, such as the LDL cholesterol, and that is safe. On the other hand, the mono and polyunsaturated fats were liquid at room temperature. Okay, so that was, the science was a lot more complicated than what we realized. Okay, and again, as we talked about a little while ago, sugar and the rise of diabetes was the association that was. Now again, similarly, even in other countries, it became apparent. Then when Yemeni Jews were brought to Israel, their diets changed dramatically from unprocessed food. They started eating more Western diet, and with the rise of cholesterol. Similarly, studies were done with Asian Indians in Africa when their diets changed and with their sugar intake increased. The rise of diabetes became apparent. Now I'm going to try to see if I can, and at the same time, the American Heart Association had proposed a national cholesterol education program based on various guidelines to reduce just saturated fats to less than 7% of total calories and cholesterol to less than 200 milligrams, and increasing recommended polyunsaturated fats. So this became the norm, and obviously with the heart disease deaths were very apparent much more quickly, and among middle-aged white males. So that carried, the national programs carried a lot of weight, and the American Diabetic Association, again, adopted the same guidelines. And but at the same time, the advertising industry changed their status by carrying out a campaign of low-fat diet. All sorts of products were. Okay, I'm sorry, I was trying to open that link, which did not work. Let's see if I can go back into the other side, and open it. Yes, I might be able to open it. Let me see if I can share that or not. Okay. Yes. This was a paper that was written in the from an Oxford journal, How the Ideology of Low Fat Conquered America. Let's see if I can bring that up. No, that's harder to do, so I'm not going to jinx myself. But so if those of you who are interested, click on this thing. But it shows as to how the whole nation adopted the concept of low-fat diet, and at the same time, now on the other side of the Atlantic, Mediterranean diet became much more, and there were small trials that were done for Mediterranean diet, and which included olive oil, and that turned out to have a better outcome in reducing heart disease. And again, when we started the national campaign that went on a wide scale, popularity, and the insurance companies also went into the act from the 1950s, and showed that the diet that was high in fat was associated with higher mortality. Again, the Senate committees were appointed in 1977 under the auspices of Senator McGovern, and the various food pyramids and the preventive campaign, and the American Heart Association started labeling various foods approved by the American Heart Association. And that was a very successful and somewhat lucrative campaign. Okay, so but that's now there are some cynical voices that were being raised that about the diet, preventive medicine, but the majority of the medical community followed the consensus of reducing the fat and substituting with carbohydrates. And again, most recently, as finally, this was the slide that I talked about briefly, that as recently as April of 2003, that Harvard Health changed the tune to some extent, that it does not have to be dramatically low in fat, because and simple steps of Mediterranean diet was recommended, and showed some significant decrease in hazard ratio of primarily of heart disease and other complications of atherosclerosis. Okay, now we learned that we didn't talk about the other factor which has been emphasized for diet, which is the fiber. Now it's an interesting story. This picture is not for the faint-hearted, but I'll show you anyway that this is the Dr. Epstein was working in Africa. He was an English physician, and associated the Epstein-Barr virus with Burkitt's lymphoma, and that was his blame to his success. And I'm sorry, let's see. And now, after his earlier experiment, he decided to pay attention to varieties of other cancers that took place, primarily colon cancer, diverticulitis. When he returned to England, he saw that these diseases were a lot more common. And then he observed the diet pattern of the middle-aged people in Uganda versus in UK, and showed that they had a lot higher fiber, they ate lots of roots and vegetables and unprocessed grains. And so he proposed the association of fiber. And then again, that idea became a lot more widely accepted on both sides of the continent. And importance of fiber became a big enthusiasm, and was associated with varieties of illnesses. Now, again, how science changes the recommendation. That is interesting to know that dietary cholesterol, and this is the article that we quoted about, there was no clear-cut evidence, but still, based on observational studies and based on large population studies, we read the conclusion, and the Time magazine got into the act. As to, you can see that, this is a few years apart, the two magazines, from the late 80s to 2000, as to how cholesterol, which was considered the bad news for cholesterol, the good news. So, the thinking changed based on the fact that in spite of reducing make diet guidelines, did not make much impact in the incidence of heart disease. And in fact, I think the average cholesterol of people who had heart disease was around 210. I mean, there is association at the high end, obviously, a lot higher incidence, but the average Joe Blow who got the heart disease did not have that high number. So there was something that was missing. Okay, so the hypothesis contributed. So it started in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was became much more firm after 10 years and continued. We already talked about the Framingham studies and okay, so finally, in last few years, dietary guidelines have removed the recommendations of drastic cholesterol restriction, and the emphasis has been changed on fats. Now, at the same time, the basic research had continued, and the biochemistry, the lipoprotein particle is a lot more complicated. The cholesterol is surrounded by various lipid layers, cholesterol, and the other types of fat called triglycerides is associated varieties of lipoprotein which carry the lipid particles from the liver and bloodstream were discovered, and the varieties of genes that are associated with cholesterol, such as the ApoE gene, were discovered. And so finally, we were getting into the basic biochemistry mechanism of heart disease and atherosclerosis process. We were learning at the molecular level as to how complex the interrelationship was. Now, at the same time, there were some paradoxes that were occurring that when people looked at the data that we were associating carbohydrates with onset of heart disease, but that was not apparent in so-called Asian paradox compared to the Western countries. As you can see in Japan and China, the total carbohydrate intake with rice and was substantial, but their sugar intake was dramatically low. So the so-called then finally thought processes changed that the oxidized LDL with the so-called reactive oxygen and the free radicals cause damage to the blood vessels. And so having elevated blood sugar, either with not being able to metabolize, was like adding fuel to the fire, and the long-term complications became apparent. And so the data was different in the G20 countries and the Asian outliers. Okay, and at the same time, there was a so-called French paradox also, that the incidence was so high in the Northern European countries. At the same time, it was different in France because their dietary pattern was a little different and in the large G20 studies that was done, that European Union had the highest rate of almost 1,100 cases per 100,000 population. So did Russia, Saudi Arabia, okay, and then Korea, Brazil, Mexico had the lowest incidence, okay, and somewhere along the line, India, even though it's not a rich country, was still way up on the list about incidence of heart disease, So the data in all across the world very dramatically, the stroke was higher in China and Indonesia. So the data showed that we cannot treat all the people with one step. Okay, when it comes to measuring, okay, initially, as we talked about earlier, that people relied on the urine testing in the early 40s, and there was a complicated measure, required complex laboratory. Finally, the test was simplified, and then various American pharmaceuticals introduced test strips in 1950s. Later on, office blood test became available, and then finally in the late 60s, early 70s, a concept called glycolated hemoglobin came into the vogue, and that showed the perspective as to how the diabetic level was for last several months, because the red blood cells are regenerated in about 120 days. So that gives us an insight and as to what the control was for last 3 months. And that became a good parameter for checking, because obviously before going to the doctors, if you improve your diet, your sugar will look better. On the other hand, if you had big donuts, your sugar will look bad. But this gives physicians and practitioners a window as to what had happened over the long duration of time. And the criteria are very apparent type of thing, that that the strict control was associated with complication of hypoglycemia. But so the good control is measured up to 6 and below. On the other hand, and anything above 90 is considered, that further some intervention, either with more vigorous diet or with adding additional medications were needed. And as you can see that the glycation means adding sugar to the protein. Hemoglobin is, after all, is a protein, is affected by varieties of factors, type thing. So, and is how the glycation of protein takes place, okay, as the sugar moiety is attaches to the hemoglobin, and that has become the measurement, the yardstick. Okay. Now, at the same time, there were some people who did, some physicians who were outliers. And an interesting story is that of a doctor named Dr. Richard Bernstein. He was a juvenile diabetic, and was an engineer. He went to medical school at a later age and became a pioneer in home blood sugar monitoring. And he somewhat revolutionized the treatment, okay, of diabetes by recommending different types of diet, and we'll go into that. He had diabetes for 75 years and had interest in science as he grew older, and so then he came up with blood glucose measurement, and he could not get a permission to buy one on his own. Okay, so he had, so glucometers are only available. He was able to obtain one finally, and with the control of meticulous control of blood sugar, he tried to develop a precise control of his blood sugar. And then he decided to go to medical school and devised various criteria of changing diet pattern of our diabetic patient, and he still continues to practice at age 9. And his approach is different than the standard guidelines that has been recommended. And with titrating the insulin precisely, he recommended how measuring the blood sugar and titrating based on home blood sugar monitoring. Okay. And again, the role of inflammation has to be brought into, as we talked about earlier, that it is inflammation, the so-called reactive oxygen thing, has a lot to do with insulin resistance and leading to vascular dysfunction. As you can see how the different types of fat has relationship, and at the same time, the fat can occur in the liver as well. So fatty liver disease is quite common in people with uncontrolled diabetes. So the lot of this, there's an strong relationship with the obvious complications of diabetes, such as hypertension and the metabolic syndrome related with inflammatory and oxygen species. At the same time, you can see there's a relationship with kidney disease as well as atherosclerosis all over the body. And varieties of other factors, plays into what is the heart association has come up with the concept of metabolic syndrome, okay, and chronic kidney disease and metabolic syndrome. And that is originate with starting with excessive adipose tissue and varieties of physiological factors, as we talked about, with insulin resistance and inflammation, how this complex interplay is related. Okay, and at the same time, we're creatures of habit, so not just genetics, but at the same time, behavior. So nature and nurture both play a role. And obviously, this can be aggravated dramatically with tobacco use, okay, and the availability of food. The easily available quick calories have a big role to play, especially, and again, with the community that you live in, at the same time, how what your resources are, as to the fast foods are cheap, and the other hand, the fresh fruits and vegetables tend to be expensive, so that all the varieties of socioeconomic conditions play a big role in leading to this complex interplay of kidney disease, heart disease, diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. Okay, and now initially, then back in the 90s, people knew that this was associated in the so-called type 2 diabetes and others, but the concept of insulin resistance came into vogue, and with the metabolic syndrome as to how once and again, as I mentioned earlier, that we were not able to measure insulin levels, and once we started being able to measure insulin level, when people learned that not as the people who developed diabetes related to obesity did not have low insulin level, but had actually had normal. So insulin was there in circulating, but was not able to effectively control the sugar. So there was a discrepancy between the two. So that's where the idea of insulin resistance. So the complex pathophysiological relationship became apparent. I think so. And so we learned a lot more with the idea of so-called insulin resistance. Okay. Okay. And again, before that concept became much more apparent, at least in the literature in the late 80s, 90s, this was considered as syndrome X or metabolic syndrome. Okay. And so then finally, the role of liver fat and the fat in the visceral fat became much more apparent. I think so. And okay, so finally we were learning how all the factors were interrelated. Okay, and the variety of etiologies where we already talked about, they're pretty self-apparently increased visceral obesity. As we get older, the incidence increases, become less active, and again, our diet habits change. And the varieties of some of the other medications that are given for other comorbidities do play a role, especially say if you're on cortisone for arthritis, or if you're on certain chemotherapeutic drug, some psychiatric drugs, all have a role in creating insulin resistance and leading to further obesity. Okay, and again, this implies the insulin resistance, how complex the relationship is with obesity and the inflammatory cytokinins, the oxidative stress, and all leads to even in the so famine in the along the when in the face of abundance, so hyperinsulinemia, and still, we're not able to control the sugar. So the varieties of feedback loops play a role. Okay, and eventually the beta cells get exhausted by producing more and more insulin, and that becomes a more and more difficult problem as time goes by. And again, when people started titrating sugar, people went from, okay, the studies were done with intensive blood sugar control, that long-term studies were done, that by trying to increase insulin to titrate blood sugar, patients' insulin requirement jumped from almost 1 digit to as much as 100 units in the course of the trial. At the same time, people gained weight. So the good intention of controlling rigid control with insulin alone did not turn out so well, did they? And it turns out, obviously, and became apparent that sometimes the obese patients have a higher insulin level due to insulin resistance. And all this is, affected by our hypothalamus, because there is certain ways. We talked about the concept, which goes back to the 19th century, of homeostasis, that the body has a certain goal that has been set and tries to achieve the norm and return to, but nature does not like surprises, so tries to return to the goal. So initially, it's easier to lose weight, and then you find a new, so your metabolic rate changes. So that's why the weight loss becomes more and more difficult as time goes by. Okay, and again, so we talked about the molecular basis, the free fatty acids, varieties of protein, and intracellular signaling, and the varieties of other chemicals that are secreted, importance of stress and inflammation. And again, even absence of adequate sleep has been associated with its loss of diurnal rhythm, and periodicity has a lot to do with it. And again, the concept of breakfast is relatively new, okay, because in the old days, in the agricultural era, people survived on 2 meals, okay, and with the rise of, processed food and breakfast, and Kellogg had a lot to do with it, with the introduction of cereal as breakfast, and then the concept became available with the uh, coming of affluence. And obviously, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the book Super Size Me, as to how the person who ate at McDonald's, all his body parameters changed dramatically, okay, within a short time. Okay, and again, as you can see that the people are constantly eating, so that anywhere you go, food is easily available. And then we'll talk about the varieties of obesity-related factors. Okay, I'm not going to get to now. Again, as to like, are we hardwired? Okay, because it's not a straightforward law of thermodynamics that we talked about earlier. No, it's not like an engine that calories in, calorie out. Because body it has a lot more. No, okay, and we are trying to, you know, try to find solution, okay, to obesity problem with drugs, whether that's the right thing or wrong. Because as we were talked about, obesity is not a new phenomenon. It dates back to the Egyptian pharaohs, the Roman emperor. Because now those of you who are history buff may know that there were vomitariums in old Rome, and some of the other rich the were had a huge problem with, there were varieties of popes who were massively obese, and obviously, died in sleep. Perhaps they had sleep apnea, okay, and even Winston Churchill may have had problem with sleep apnea. And so people who sleep poorly have low leptin levels, and they have the so-called midnight snacking syndrome. And interestingly, the largest people have been known with obesity are in a small island of Tonga in Pacific, that almost 70 to 80% of our population is obese, and that may have to do with the introduction of Western diet, genetics, and other factors. So in somewhere along the line, it stands to reason that hunger is much more powerful a factor in affecting our behavior than including even love and happiness. Okay, because starvation is a big factor. Okay, now the history of calories is interesting, that it dates back to a late physician named Lulu Hunt Peters, who was a physician in 1900, and then she became with the early days of flappers and other things, she became the diet guru and started writing the newspaper column, okay, a radio talk, and popularized the idea of calorie restriction. And again, obviously, this occurred on the tail of industrial revolution and automobiles, that measuring calories and energy equation, so that she was in the right place at the right time, so to speak. Okay. And again, and in the early 60s, the concept of female body changed from Marilyn Monroe to Twiggy and other models, as to how it has changed, and the more recent thing, as to how the shape have changed. So this is, I don't know if I can open this that easily, somewhere along the line my links are, but this is an interesting link about how the concept of beauty, from the Rubenesque beauty, the idea has changed to flappers, to Twiggy, to the more taller, well-endowed women in the recent past. So it has gone back and forth, as to how. Okay. So we talked about calories, and this was the earlier concept. This was the idea of female body. This is the artifact that was found in the early caves of hunter-gatherers. There was the concept of human body. Okay, and this is some other ones that I had imposed. You can just see how it all. And the same way, even in how variable are we? The inter-individual variability. Okay, look at all the athletes. They're all at the peak of their performance, but you can see how the elite athletes and heavy athletes so you can just see that we just can't rely on the BMI as as the only one yardstick. You can see from the Japanese wrestler to somebody who has less than 5% body fat, the discus thrower, basketball player. So if we measure the BMI areas, they're going to be totally different in these people. And again, the diet, calories in, calories out. This was the book that she wrote earlier. Okay, Lulu Hunt Peters. And even after 100 years, we're still fighting the battle as to how the counting calories versus calories don't count. Giles Yeo is an English geneticist, PhD, and he has done a lot of work on the genes and obesity. So these are some of the works that are of interest. Okay, and again, that we talked about thermodynamics. That it's not just a simple concept of calories in, calories out. Okay, and so again, how the science is different from what the physicians have prescribed. Okay, because again, medical knowledge, has to make decision on the fly, so to speak. They do not have the luxury of researching a subject material for 7 or 8 years or even 20 years for that matter. And so the advice that was given, and again, so some of the other stuff was done by a guy named Atwater, who was an agriculture chemist, and who again put the concept, that the calorie concept, on a more scientific basis, and again devised the calorimeter and put the, so calories became, and with the rations and other things about, became, so he was a popularizer of, and became the so-called father of the American nutrition, about the standardized formulas, he came up with, and he determined the caloric value of all this, all the foods. Okay, so, and he defined calories as to what, the Latin origin of 1 kilogram of water to be raised by 1 centigrade. Okay, so, and so this concept was, promoted and was taken in the factories by Taylorism, which he was an industrial thing about the work motion studies that were done. Okay, so varieties of, and again, the advertising industry got into it, the calories count, as to how they started promoting calories, which were high in carbohydrates, okay, and low in fat. And so the concept, or the false promise, became apparent as to how, just you can eat, take in calories because they are low in fat, so to speak. So we increased our calorie intake dramatically. Okay, and then okay, so that's so. Or good ideas, and the misleading labels, the advertising industry took advantage of it by putting, for example, on purely plant-based products, say no cholesterol. There's no way you can have cholesterol, okay? And made with lightly sweet, the so-called keto diet, uncured. So, and the American Heart Association played along with the diet industry by giving labels. They're approved by American Heart Association. So, okay, we have already talked at length about the obesity pyramid. Okay, and the popular concept, so it became a big business as to, and the varieties of factor which we talked about, okay, and fat shaming, becoming obese became almost of a crime. Now the pendulum has swung to the other side by some small group of people, or saying as to how, that like the deaf community saying, well, the being the so-called fat pride, with with all the movements that are starting with, like accepting deafness as a norm, or accepting, with the other movements that have gone on, fat pride has come into the vogue. Now, the body mass index, as how you can see, it has changed over the years. Unfortunately, I don't think this will play. Yeah, oh yeah, it will play probably. Okay, let me see if I can get it to play in the other side. As you can see how on this slide that plays on this side, but not, is how the pyramids have changed over the years, So this is a nice a graphic image as to how the pyramids of body mass index has changed over the decades, from 1984. So we can just see how the obesity epidemic has increased. Okay, hopefully you can still see the slides. Okay. Now, when the varieties of theories of obesity have been proposed, that the lack of will was the popular idea in general biochemist, and the fat cell is not just a passive storage mechanism. So varieties of our brain has a lot more role. And back in the 50s, finally, the role of triglyceride, the fats and the free fatty acids became apparent. The obesity research, even complete starvation does not lead to long-term loss. Okay. And so a lot of research was done earlier to show the role of central nervous system, i.e. hypothalamus, was proposed, in the role of physiology. Okay, so varieties of other ideas have been proposed, as to how uh, just with the energy balance to carbohydrate and insulin model and reactive oxygen species, and there is something called the obesinogens, which are the various environmental chemicals that interfere with the hormonal signaling leading to obesity. So varieties of theories have been proposed and have been invoked from time to time. Okay, the increased incidence of obesity, as you can see, that is strongly related to poverty. And you can see in the southern states, it's a huge this thing. It's a huge explosion over the number of years that has taken place, as to how it's really related to economics. Okay, I think this is a video, but I'm not going to show it to you because it probably can make it rejected for copyrights. Okay, so let's just skip that one. Okay, and that was a commercial for Coke, that as to how I like to buy the whole world a Coke. And so that again increased, even in the developing countries, Coke became, extreme popular, and their sales just kept increasing dramatically. And and so now, and even childhood obesity is increasing dramatically across. You could just see how, that is the more scary thing as to how even children are becoming obese. Okay, and part of that may have to do with the advertising industry, as to these are some of the earlier commercial, which almost makes you cringe when we look at it in the present time, as to kids need energy candy that gives energy. Okay, introduce and pure pleasure. Okay, so that's, this were the early days of 50s commercials, which are, I think nowadays we would just, okay. And again, with the rise of corn-based things that took place after the Second World War, then that we changed from munitions to fertilizers. Okay, and varieties of risk factors for childhood obesities. You can say, if I can probably zoom in on it further. Complication, increased intracranial pressure, the usual culprits that we saw in adults, and again, kidney disease, bronchial asthma, all of these are related to, childhood obesity. So, okay, and now again, with the industrial production of farming, we became, you may recall that the increased fertilizer that came into use after the Second World War, when people were able to synthesize ammonia and the food production increased dramatically. And then corn, so-called fructose-based syrup, became available, and that just spread worldwide. That even with the opening of China, we started exporting fertilizers to China. Okay, and on the other hand, finally uh, the Diabetic Association came up with the concept of glycemic index, which is how quickly a food turns into calorie, because foods that are difficult to metabolize have a low glycemic index versus processed foods such as pasta or parboiled rice. Okay, so the glycemic index changes dramatically, type of thing. Okay, and that is one way to control the diet. And the high glycemic index foods, which include white bread, bagels, processed cereal, instant oatmeal, potatoes, white rice, sugar, watermelon, and even milk and yogurt. The low glycemic index foods include barley, okay, and quinoa, and so this, so it varies. So depending upon, not all carbohydrates are identical. So that's the point that one wants to get across. Okay. And this is again another concept of the obesity epidemic across the world. See how, we changed dramatically over the number of years, and the percentage of people are overweight. And the problem is spreading even in the developing nations. Okay, and we talked about the other islands and the Middle East, so the numbers are okay. Now all this is again fairly complicated, that the genes have a lot to do with it. For example, their genes have control with your taste balance, and then there are people who think that Brussels sprouts are better, and this is directly related the same way. And a gene for obesity was discovered, the discovery of a hormone called leptin. A mouse that had leptin deficiency was obese, and that was written down by genetics. Okay. So it senses the amount of food that it produces society. So the mouse with no leptin gene becomes obese at the same time, And obesity does turn into families. Identical twins which were raised apart, have a 70% incidence of obesity. Okay, same way, And then we talked about the fructose that became much more available after Second World War. I'm sorry, let me go back. And it is intricately related to varieties of other disease processes, as you can see how it's related to gout, fatty liver disease, okay, and how it is intricately related. It has and the other diseases that we already talked about, as to how fructose get inside the cell, related to various immune complexes and proteins, and leads to hypertension, fatty liver disease, and all the usual culprits that we have seen. Okay, excessive fruit intake. So it's a big driving force for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and with the fructose-based syrup has probably contributed substantially to the rise in obesity that we are seeing. Okay, I think we're coming up to 1 hour. I will stop at this stage, and we'll continue the next time.